of those that did not survive. If we remain unconscious to, engage in, and collude with victim blaming, we make dangerous perpetrators even more invisible. Victim blaming means that their actions come secondary to what the victim or survivor should have or shouldn't have done. We exonerate perpetrators of the responsibility for abuse and for the death by placing it firmly in the hands of the victim themselves. We ask them why they didn't disclose the abuse. We ask them why they didn't tell us sooner, why they didn't leave, why they didn't protect the children, why they did retaliate. Michelle goes on to say, those who hold power, and by that I mean most professionals, regardless of rank or position, have a responsibility to not just acknowledge victim blaming, but to call it out as one of the most fatal flaws in our response to perpetrators of domestic abuse. If we allow it to continue, we give the green light to current and future perpetrators that there will be a ready-made set of excuses sitting on the shelf for you when you choose to abuse or even commit murder. We have a choice to decide who we'd like to be as a person and as a professional. And I compel you to consider how you want to contribute to ending perpetrators' power and raising victim status. A woman is at most at risk when she leaves the relationship. And Dawn was a mother. And children are not witnesses to domestic abuse. They are victims. And their voices deserve to be heard. So this is your chance, Scotland. Whew, you've got one police force. You take this opportunity and take all the good from working models and all the research. And you make it better. And you're not perfect. And nothing is. And we all make errors along the way. We just have to concentrate on not making those errors cost lives. And whether a domestic homicide review or a significant case review, the victim deserves your time and respect. Same go for the family, the friends, the colleagues the victim has, as the families are integral to any review you have. And if you want to make real change, then make your IDVAs and your ISVAs the biggest voices in the room, because they've got the competency in work hours alone to be your biggest asset you have. They are the ones that will help you with your homicide prevention advocacy. Fund them. Give them strategic lead roles. Ensure their independence. Listen to what they're saying, because they're the voice of the victim. Money won't stop men's violence against women and girls. And money is only second to will. You have to want to stop it. It requires a seismic societal change. In fact, 98% of all violent crime is committed by males, right? Just saying. Following fatal domestic abuse, the injustice amounts to a life sentence of suffering for family and friends. Her name was Dawn. She was my sister and I loved her, not just another. Thank you for listening.
Kirsty, thank you so much. I think Dawn would feel like you did her proud. And may the work that we do in Scotland also do make her proud and you proud. Thank you. Moment of silence. Just saying. I'd like to introduce next an amazing expert from the Mediterranean Institute on Gender Studies and a dear friend. Zuzana Pavlou has over 15 years of experience in research, policy development, and policy monitoring and evaluation, with particular experience on gender equality and violence against women. She's widely recognized at the European level, in the EU and the Council of Europe, with the European Institute of Gender Equality, all three of which I've worked with her in, as one of the leading lights to do research, to oversee research, and to provide advocacy and impact in the context of European policymaking. I am absolutely delighted to have her today to talk about a European-wide study that looked at femicide and what some of the conclusions were in that. And I'm really looking forward to being able to reflect those and the things that we've heard from all of the other speakers in creating a Scottish model that picks its head up out of the UK and looks across the world and takes the learning that we have from people like Zuzana and puts it to good use in the name of the women and children and men whose lives have been lost because of domestic abuse. Zuzana, over to you, honey.
Thank you so much, Marcia. I'm feeling a little emotional, I have to say, after Kirsty's intervention. I feel that after that, we just said, enough said. I want to thank you and Scottish Women's Aid for the invitation. It's a privilege for me to be participating in this event and to have such an incredible learning experience by listening to these amazing speakers. And if I could just, call them out, and Fiona and David Mandel and Kirsty, really, I feel after listening to this afternoon, I want to go back and write this project proposal all over again, because I feel that I've received and learned so much. So thank you, and it's a real privilege. So I'm going to try and share my screen, and I hope we have no issues. Marcia, call out if you can see my presentation.
Yep,
great.
Looking good.
Great, thank you so much. I'm gonna, oh right, and I should put, I'm taking good tips from David and putting my my timer on, because I do tend to go over time. So again, thank you for having me. I'm going to present a project that we're still running, actually, that is being co-financed by the Rights, Equality and Citizenship Program of the European Union, that we called Fem United, to prevent IPV and DV. I know we call it domestic abuse. I agree. We have different terms, in different countries, and also related to translation issues, because this is a project that crosses 5 countries across the EU, which I'll be presenting what we've been doing, some of our research results as succinctly as possible. I will be pointing you to where you can find, the full research reports and so on, and some of the other stuff that we've produced around awareness raising and training. So the start of our campaign, we have our slogan, and I've been hearing this a lot this afternoon. Domestic abuse homicide is preventable, femicide is preventable, and our slogan is connect the dots. If I can, I would like to start with a small video that we produced. I know this is going to take time away from my speaking, but never mind. I would like to share it with you, and maybe it works if technology is on our side. So I'm just going to press play. Nope. And that is in a different language, so I'm going to play this one.
Should there be sound?
Is there sound?
No.
There is no sound. Okay, scrap that.
Wait,
I will.
There's a wee button. There's a wee button you have to press in the top right-hand corner when you share a video
Is there?
to get sound
I
on
don't
it.
want to. Yeah, I don't want to take time away from Marsha's wrap up. So I will point you to the videos at the end, and maybe we can try again if there's a minute left at the end. Okay, so I'll just push on. Just to give a little bit of background to this project, how we started. I'm just going to put the full screen on. Right, there we go. So how it all began, there was a COST action, which is a European EU-funded research collaboration, which are called COST, that many of you might be aware of. It's a research network. There were 90 researchers involved from 29 countries. That it was running from 2014 to 2017, and it resulted in the establishment of the European Observatory on Femicide, which we call the EOF, that was established in 2018. And in a nutshell, it is involved in developing qualitative and quantitative data collection tools in order to collect data on femicide across Europe, and contribute to prevention policies. There are 23 research focal points across Europe, and it includes Israel, who was also involved in the COST action. And this led to a joint project proposal. As Marsha knows, we submit multiple proposals for which we don't get funding, and then we have that aha moment in which our evaluators think that we are worth investing in. So our third proposal was successful, and it led to this project, the FemUnited project, United to Prevent Femicide in Europe, which has been running since 2020. It is going to, we're wrapping it up in a couple of months. So we're towards the end of the project, and it does cross, it does include 5 countries: Cyprus, Malta, Portugal, Spain, and Germany. It includes universities, research institutes, as well as NGOs. We feel that this collaboration of women specialist organizations, NGOs working specifically on women's rights and violence against women, and bringing this together with the knowledge and expertise of academics and researchers that work specifically on violence against women and girls and domestic abuse, that lead to projects that have a greater impact and don't just end up on someone's dusty shelf. So the goals of the project include, what we wanted to do was to shine a spotlight on the urgent need to develop and implement effective strategies for preventing femicide. So although we did enhance existing data collection tools that were developed through the observatory, our focus is on generating this data in order to feed into prevention activities, including awareness raising, and that includes some of the videos that I wanted to show you earlier, but I'll get into that a little bit later. The development of multi-agency competencies in the field of intimate partner violence and domestic abuse, cross-institutional trainings, training workshops for the media as well, but also police and practitioners across health, social services, and also the violence against women sectors in the partner countries. And another important aspect of the work that we've been doing is cooperation with political decision makers and institutional decision makers across the sector, and what we call stakeholder engagement, precisely in order to feed our project results into the work they are doing and to influence policy making and prevention policies. So what we've achieved so far, we've developed country background papers which describe the national situation, our legal and policy frameworks, existing policy, prevention policies, what our multi-agency working setups and institutional setups look like, where the gaps and challenges are. We looked at media coverage of femicide and domestic abuse killings, and all of that was put together into country reports. We developed data collection tools that would qualitative and quantitative, because what we wanted to do was collect data that we could, that was comparable across the countries that were participating in the project. And also, of course, we did want to collect the numbers. We wanted to measure the prevalence of femicide. We know that there are weaknesses in our methodologies, as there are weaknesses in institutional data collection. But we wanted to use it as an advocacy tool. We developed a comparative report, which I'm going to give you the link a little bit later towards the end of the presentation. Some of the results which I will be presenting today, very small part of them because of our restrictions on time, but mainly I wanted to go through our recommendations for prevention, a lot of which we've been, will be sort of, we've already heard on today, but sort of, I think that that's important too, because we can see that across countries, so outside Scotland and outside the United States, and we can see how similar some of the challenges are, and how similar some of our findings are, and our recommendations for policy change and for systems change are. So just to get a little bit into our research results. So the first thing that we wanted to do was look at, okay, where are the gaps and where are the challenges? And this was part of our sort of looking at the different frameworks in the countries that we were looking at. So just a reminder, we were looking at Cyprus, Germany, Malta, Portugal, and Spain, which is quite diverse in terms of geographical distribution, but also, cultural aspects, and some a little bit more developed in terms of, system responses, some underdeveloped, but also I would say in terms of the violence against women sector in Cyprus, and this sector is quite underdeveloped, whereas in Spain, Germany, for example, it is much more developed. So it was interesting to see what the different, whether we could find commonalities in the gaps and challenges that we find in the different countries. And so I'm just sort of very generalizing, of course, in order for the purposes of the presentation. But what we found was a lack of a gendered perspective in law, policy, and practice. Something that we repeat over and over again. We find it over and over again in our research, and in our contact and in our stakeholder engagement, that the gendered perspective is lacking. Our gendered understanding of domestic abuse, of violence against women and girls is lacking. So in some countries, it is there in law, so they have more developed and more gender-sensitive laws that understand the gendered dynamics of domestic abuse and violence against women, but this might not. There are gaps in implementation and what this looks like in policy and practice. And in other countries, we found that we had gender-neutral laws. Marcia would say gender-blind laws that did not take into account, even on the legal level, a gendered understanding of domestic abuse. We found inadequate protection measures for victims and their children. We found that protection measures are not based on systematic and dynamic assessment of risk, often seeing evidence of too little, too late. Also found that risk to the mother is seen as separate to the risk to her children. And children, one example is that in Cyprus, for example, children are not included in protection orders. So a mother might have a protection order, but the father will still have rights, if you like, and we'll still, we even have women who are in refuge, are being housed in shelters where fathers have access to their children, can come and pick up their children and take them to the park. So we found that this is a massive weakness and failing in terms of the system response. Of course, lack of comprehensive data across the criminal justice system. We're not able to track cases across the system, which makes it difficult to identify system failures or system gaps. We found that Spain had the most, out of the countries that we looked at, had the most developed administrative and criminal data, and it was more, that facilitated tracking cases across the system. We found a lack of effectiveness in risk assessment, but mainly because it was not linked to risk management. Risk assessment was focused on victim behavior, and we've heard this afternoon, rather than perpetrator management. We found risk factors that were not sensitive to coercive and controlling behavior that we know, and we've heard exhaustively today, that is a better predictor of lethality. Risk assessment that are not child competent or applicable to women of migrant background and women with disabilities and other women that we found through our data collection that are at a higher risk. We found weaknesses in interagency cooperation, procedures and protocols were weak, the poor coordination that were not based on solid protocols, gaps in information sharing, and of course, no common understanding of the gender dynamics of domestic abuse, no shared language around risk that led to gaps at the systems level in victim protection and hindering prevention interventions. Again, very quickly, we've heard it, training of frontline professionals. And what we were looking at specifically is, as Kirsty said, those harmful attitudes, behaviors, and stereotypes, we call them ABS within our, that was the language we used in our project. And these victim blaming attitudes that she so effectively talked about, and how dangerous they are. And this, when we were focusing on our training and building professional competencies, this is precisely what we were focusing on. So in terms of what we found in prevalence, very quickly, in total 629 women. We were looking at the years 2019 and 2020. And so in total, we found that 629 women were killed. And we see that in terms of numbers, like raw numbers, the highest prevalence was in Germany, followed by Spain, and less so in terms of absolute numbers in Portugal, then Cyprus, and then Malta. But what we found is if you look at the population-based rates, and I remind the Cyprus stakeholders in my meetings with them and my consultations with them all the time, that we have in Cyprus the highest population-based rate for those years. And we did have, and just to share this with you, in 2019, we had 7 victims from a serial killer who killed 5 women and 2 girls, which were the children of 2 of those women. And so we often hear, it's like, oh, yes, but that was an exceptional case because we had the serial killer. And so really, these numbers are not representative. So what we did is we actually removed those numbers, right? And still, without those victims, which include women and children, we still have the highest population-based rate in Cyprus. And just for FYI, our population is about 950,000. So we found that intimate partner killings, what we call in this conference, domestic abuse killings, was the most common form of femicide, 60% of all identified victims. And these are identified victims. We know that the number is higher. We know that there are cases that are not identifiable, and that in our own research, we have not been able to identify because of lack of data. And the majority of killings took place in the victim's home, right? In terms of the victim-perpetrator relationship, most women were killed, were still in a relationship with the perpetrator. But again, and no separation was noticed, or at least we did not have information to say that it was in the context of separation. But interestingly enough, the numbers conflicted with the evidence that we found in our qualitative data collection, which I won't have time to present to you today, which found that separation, that killings in the context of separation was most prevalent and was the most dangerous period for women and their children. And so we take the data that we found in this sense, we take it with caution. In terms of type of killing, again, as you can see, it was mostly during a relationship, but of course we don't have the evidence. We cannot say whether there was a planned separation. We find that there were smaller numbers in the context of sexual violence or in the context of women in prostitution. But again, this data is not systematically collected, and we do recognize that many of these killings are not recognized as gender-based killings or femicide. So what we found, very briefly, we have a high prevalence of femicide that was documented in all countries, even with the gaps that we had in our data collection and our recognition that the numbers are probably much higher than what we found. We found that there's an urgent need for effective prevention of femicides, and there are gaps and weaknesses in system responses, that there's a need for nationwide, holistic, multidimensional interventions to end gender-based killings of women. We found through our qualitative data that there were few indications of previous domestic violence or threat. So within the system, there was no history recorded. There was no system involvement in many of the cases that we were looking at. No previous reports. Primary as well as secondary interventions and awareness raising is required at all levels of society and institution, precisely to address harmful attitudes and behaviors within the system and within professionals, as Kirsty indicated. Intervention and sanction practice of police and judiciary must be improved. We found that we need to look more carefully, and there needs to be more focus on perpetrator management, on offender management, rather than controlling, if you like, or victim behavior. And some of our recommendations: a consistent intervention and comprehensive protection for women at risk, implementation of standardized, gender-sensitive and child-competent risk assessment in all institutions. We are recommending multi-agency standardized risk assessment that takes into account coercive and controlling behaviors. We found that many of the risk assessment tools that are used in the countries that we were looking at are not gender-sensitive, do not take into account risk factors associated with coercive controlling behavior, and are not child competent. I'll be finishing very quickly because my alarm has gone off. Further development of national tools for assessing risk that identify patterns of control and coercion. Focus more on perpetrator and offender management rather than managing victim behavior. The need for more systematic application and monitoring of protective measures that include protective measures for children, including protection orders, investing in women's specialist services, sustainable funding, listening to women's specialist service, because precisely as Kirsty said, they do advocate for victims, and in many cases they are their voice. Safety of women and children in court custody and contact decisions. We found that court custody and contact decisions are failing women and their children, and often domestic abuse escalates and is perpetrated within that framework. That more investment needs to be put in primary education, primary prevention, in education, in working with the media, investing in gender equality and women's rights, awareness raising campaigns and media training, looking at multi-agency and multidisciplinary training that should be mandatory and systematic across the sector, and should include raising awareness on the gender dynamics of violence against women, looking at harmful attitudes and behaviors and gender stereotypes that are embedded within the system, including the judiciary, both in family court and the criminal court. That there needs to be legislative change where it's needed, and updating of judicial practices. Finishing up right now. And again, I won't repeat some of that we've already said. I just want to, this very last point, that recognition of children as victims in their own right is one of the recommendations we're making as a project, strengthening child protection system and support to children in criminal justice processes. And I'll end there. I'm just putting up the links to our website and the Connect the Docs playlist, where we have the videos that have been translated in 5 languages. That might be useful tools in our trainings and for our awareness raising in our own sector and in our own organizations. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you for what is clearly helpful and groundbreaking research, and I will certainly be coming back to you, ma'am, for some follow-up information. But it is so interesting about how it crosses over so much of what we heard in really diverse countries and service systems, and so much of it comes down to gender. It is my unhappy task in some ways to find a way to summarize some of this, and I'm not actually going to do that. I'm going to do a very whistle-stop tour about some of the really what I thought were moving or just, you know, aggravating, energizing points that were made by the speakers, and then finish up really quickly with what comes next. So I just wanted to pick out a couple of things. One is Fiona. I've heard Fiona speak a number of times, and it just breaks my heart about Emily, and I'm so filled with admiration about the work that Emily Tess does. But she said something which really stuck with me this time, which is that their work and her presentation identified a series of mistakes, not just one mistake, not just one agency, but a series of mistakes that any of which, if they hadn't happened, might have saved Emily's life. And I think that we heard all the way through how critical it is that we have this that we respond to risk in a systematic way, and that all elements of the sector and of the system have to be competent. We're not asking for over and above. We're just asking for competence here. And I think Jane really underscored that when she talked about all of the ways that we ignore the information around the homicide timeline, but really picked up on what she was talking about coercive control. And it was such a theme through all of this, about the importance of coercive and controlling behaviors as a significant risk factor for lethality. And all the way through, and you know, risk assessments that are not sensitive to coercive and controlling behaviors. This is an issue in Scotland. We've been banging on that drum a little bit. We'd like to see people take it up. And out of the 2 hard box needs to come risk assessment of children. How do we do that in the context of domestic abuse? Both getting assessing their risk and getting the information from children who are not merely witnesses, but also victims, to help create a holistic risk profile rather than having this continued separation, as Susanna pointed out, of risk assessment, of responses to children and responses to their mothers. The theme of advocacy came up multiple times, and I think, of course, in Jane's presentation and in David's, but the words that Kirsty said really stick with me, and they were that if you care about improving your system's response to women who are at risk or who have been killed, and children who have been killed in domestic abuse killings, make the advocates, the voices of the advocates, the loudest ones in the room, and we can help with that. David's data, always fascinating. Safe and Together is one of the best tools, I think, that exist in the world for revealing victim blaming, for challenging gender incompetence, and for giving people real tools for improving their practice. And anybody who's not deeply conversant with the Safe and Together work, we can help with that too. I think one of the other things that Kirsty said, which was so powerful, was that that when her sister needed help, when her sister was on her knees, she got arrested. And we really can't take our eyes off that ball, off that, problem of women being arrested who are victims of domestic abuse. And then when she was wound up in the service system, that it was a quote unquote shitstorm, and that they took a woman on her knees and slapped her down. And I think we really have to take responsibility across the system for scrutinizing our systems for victim blaming. Because my final point, I think, and this was made over and over by the speakers and emerges in the research over and over, is that probably the biggest risk factor for those experiencing domestic abuse for being murdered is victim blaming in our system, and the behavior of perpetrators and the perpetrator pattern, as David would say. It has been such an afternoon. So I want to end by saying 5 years on, we are not going to have this meeting again in 5 years when there has been no progress. I commit absolutely to that. Not that it was in my power the last time, I suppose, but I want to say that what we will be doing with the information that we have here is convening, and with, we hope, some of the same speakers, is convening a roundtable in 16 days of activism on violence against women and girls to agree a plan for creating the Scottish model for following domestic abuse killings, and a timescale for implementation of that with our, I hope, our allies in the Scottish Government, in Police Scotland, in the Crown Office, in assist, and in the victim support, and in the whole, across the whole sector in Scotland. We will create a timescale. We will create a draft model. We will invite response and feedback and consultation across the sector from local authorities and from those who will have to implement all of these actions as we go forward. And then we will call for a one-year test of this new model, and then a review and an improvement plan at the end of that. So that is where we're going. We hope a lot of you will be on this journey with us. If you're willing for us to include you in the consultation elements of this piece of work and the development of a Scottish model, please let us know. We would be deeply grateful for your help and your participation. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that we also have some other tools to help with this process. And if you are inclined to look for more training, or if you have colleagues that you think need more training, please do take a look at the Scottish Women's Aid training calendar. We do trainings on domestic abuse killings, on suicidality, and we have one coming up, if I can find the note here, in December on the importance of advocacy and pathways to support. I think our own Jody McVicker is running that, and you can find links for that training on the Scottish Women's Aid website. I think that's me. I hope I made it in my 10 minutes, and I cannot tell you how grateful I am, first of all, for the 160 plus of you who are still here, but also for the other many hundreds who were here on and off during the afternoon. And a huge, huge thank you to the Scottish Women's Aid staff who conceived of this, who put it together, and who have taken notes about how we can be better on the tech next time. So huge thank you to everybody. And I really hope you have a good evening.
Thank you.
You're welcome, everybody.
Thank you. Most enjoyable. Thank you. Very informative. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.